As a reminder, there will be some very strong images in today's show that may be uncomfortable, so I suggest you don't listen to it while you're eating. Hello and welcome to MetaNights. I'm Loku, a collector of stories, where we tell your story.
A man from another company in Qingdao told me a story, and he said that it was about 2 years ago, and that summer was the season when the frequency of lonely deaths was higher because of the heat and the frequency of reported cases, and their cleaning task was heavier. He took a picture of the old man lying in a rocking chair, his body was rotten, and only his torso was left, and he had a bowl with grapes in it, and the grapes were rotten, but you could tell they were fruit grapes. He was lying in a rocking chair, probably eating grapes, and then suddenly he was gone.
The concept of lone death comes from the Japanese language and first appeared in the Japanese news in the 1970s, referring to the death of a person living alone in his or her home due to illness or accident, and no one knows about it. According to statistics from NHK TV in 2010, about 32,000 people die alone in Japan every year, most of whom are elderly people living alone, and often the bodies are not discovered until days or even months after the death. Over the years, as Japan's society ages, the number of lonely deaths has increased, and a number of special cleaning companies have emerged to clean up the homes of those who died alone. Today's narrator, Feng, is a media personality who has many years of experience as an investigative journalist. In 2018, Feng and his team began working on a show about lonely death. They joined 2 special cleaning companies in Osaka and Tokyo as interns to learn about the industry and the situation of lonely death in Japan.
I actually came into contact with a lot of cleaning companies at the same time, and it wasn't just that one because it was too difficult for us to film special cleaning in Japan, so you had to cast a wide net to see which cleaning company would let me intern, let me work with them, let us film. But the company I worked for in Osaka was special because it had a special warehouse, and the warehouse was divided into 2 floors, and what touched me the most was the small space on the 2nd floor where there were many statues and shrines from the homes of the dead who died alone. You know that many Japanese people believe in Buddhism, and they will put up some Buddhist shrines in their homes. These things are called memories by this company. This company considers them very special things. If the family of the deceased does not want them, or if the deceased cannot find his family, then they will pull them back and put them in that space on the 2nd floor. They will ask the monk to come and read the sutra, which is very decent, and then they will give an account of these objects and then dispose of them in a uniform manner. But I have come into contact with a lot of companies, including those with triad backgrounds, and others that are quite interesting and have their own stories, but when each person tells me about it, I find that people in the special cleaning industry have all kinds of horrible scenes in their heads, but they are very calm when they tell me about it. Every time they cleaned the place, there were, say, 10 people there, 3 of them, 2 or 3 of them were regular employees, and some of them were temporary workers from all walks of life, and they were very strange. I remember one of them, the one with a perm and a designer bag, came over and I talked to 2 of them, and one of them was very enthusiastic and talked to me in English. But I believe this job must be a few thousand yuan a day, so for them, and they don't feel any psychological burden, they don't feel very dirty.
After a brief training, Feng entered the scene of an old man's death as an intern for a special cleaning company. The cost of cleaning the house was about 30,000 renminbi. The victim, Kawa, was unmarried and lived alone in a 2-story house on a corner in Osaka. The first person to find the body was a passerby who was passing by and smelled the smell, so he called the police.
The whole 2-story building was full of debris and garbage, and as soon as we went in through the front door and the door opened, we found that there was no way in and all the debris was up to the ceiling. Then another trainee told me that it was bodily fluids, and when I went in, I found that the whole floor was slippery. He said that the dead old man's torso had been removed a long time ago, but when he was found, he had already been dead for a week or 2, so his bodily fluids had already penetrated all kinds of debris we saw, including the floor. Although he had a 2-story mansion, he lived in a small room downstairs for more than 10 years, a small room of 5 square meters, filled with his daily necessities and garbage. Most of the plastic garbage bags were filled with uneaten food, some cookies, just boxes, so it looked like a garbage dump. He died on his bed, but it wasn't even a bed, it was a mattress. Although the bed was submerged in the garbage, there was a big stain in the middle of the bed that was left after the body fluids had seeped in, and it was very obvious that it was not human, but you could see that it was just a stain. After that, I kept holding my breath, and that's what you can't control. In 2005, I remember going to the South Asia earthquake when more than 100,000 people died. I remember once I was standing in a ruin, and after talking to the headquarters on the phone, I always felt a strange smell in the air and asked my driver about my fixer, and he said, "Don't you know that this is the smell of decomposing bodies?" So I would say that after suddenly entering that room and smelling that smell, I would feel that the smell is familiar is a thing, but really you will feel that after working for a long time you will feel a little unbearable. It is not the usual is the smell of our usual food decay, it is still because it is the human body, and then that smell is really indescribable, is very after working for a long time. I forgot that suddenly I felt a sticky and slippery feeling on the skin of my hands, and then it suddenly occurred to me that the body fluids had already seeped in. That was the moment when I discovered this, and I rushed out. I remember I spent 5 minutes running to the park next door to wash my hands, and it was really disgusting, and I had to adjust the position of my mask without knowing it, and occasionally I would take a breath and I kept my gloves on and adjusted it.
Feng briefly asked Kawa's brother for some basic information about the family and learned that Mr. Kawa was 75 years old when he died and had never married in his life.
On the day of the cleaning, this brother was the youngest brother, and he was here, and there was another brother who was present but not in front of the camera, and he was the oldest brother. After my father retired, he closed the clinic and lived on the second floor, but at that time, before and after that, except for my father's retirement, all the brothers had already started their own families and moved out, so naturally, he said, like many Japanese families, they stopped seeing each other. At first, they would come back once a year, but then they stopped coming back occasionally, and then they stopped talking on the phone. His brother knew that before his father died more than 10 years ago, his father lived upstairs and he lived downstairs, and they had a very bad relationship. Of course, the things that he put in his room and collected in his living space would seem to be newer than the garbage he produced during the last time he left this world. I have a deep impression that on the windowsill, for example, he had a lot of medical books that were probably his father's, because his father was a doctor, and then there were his letters, and they said he was a lonely old man, and his brother said that he was a lonely old man who never dealt with people. But that's what the outside world knows about an old man who is a lonely old man. But whether that's actually true or not, I don't know. At least he had friends, and he had close correspondence with this friend or friends. His brother said he never had a girlfriend, but we saw a little pink ornament with a heart-shaped design and a phrase in English written on the side, and that was a shock to me. I would say that an old man who was described as a loner, but in reality, his world was not what we thought it was. There was also a bow and arrow on the wall, a set of arrows that the old man would have played archery with his name engraved on the bow and arrow at some point in his life. I think he had a happy and harmonious family life, but his brothers ignored each other, and his relationship with his father deteriorated, and so on. His brother was also evasive, so he didn't want to say too much, but in fact it was more because he didn't know what happened. One detail is that I asked his brother, I said, you hadn't seen each other for so many years before Kawa's death, but did you have phone contact? He said Kawa called me a year or two ago. After the front door was cleared, I realized that this was the outline of the clinic, with a small window, a waiting room, a pharmacy, and a consultation room. What struck me most was that there was a calendar on the wall dating back to 1988, the year Kawa's father retired, which means that this calendar has been there since he retired. I don't know if it's deliberate or if it's because no one really cares. And the calendar on the wall, the main picture on it is a map of the community that he served, a map of the streets. So when you look at this detail, you think about the fact that this family, in fact, his father practiced medicine here for so many years, and you imagine that many of the people in the neighborhood who came to this clinic were his father's patients, many of them must have grown up with Kawa or with him. But in the end, it turned out that not only did the family not care about Kawa's death, but the neighbors didn't care either, and no one came to ask. I don't know if they respected the family's privacy or if they just didn't care, but I think it was quite realistic.
When the family asks a special cleaning company to clean the home of an elderly person who died alone, they usually make specific requests, such as for the staff to help find and keep bank card documents or items with special memories. The family of Kawa's old man asked that all of them be cleaned out, including Kawa's collection of artifacts, DVDs, and albums of airplanes and birds.
His brother and his brother told the company that nothing would be left behind, nothing would be left behind. So when I was sorting out these items, I found them and I thought, oh, you should ask them again. I talked to the intern teacher, and the intern teacher said, you don't have to ask. But he told me not to ask because he said first of all, they already had this instruction, and secondly, the whole cleaning site disappeared when his brother opened the door for us. Of course, if we think about this issue with a little bit of grace, it's probably true for everyone. But the problem is that his family is still there, and all the traces of his connection to the world are not actually retained by anyone, and that's one of the cruelest things.
After cleaning up Kawa's house, Feng went to the scene of another lonely death in Tokyo, this time of an 81-year-old woman, but unlike Kawa, this one had a daughter and the two lived close to each other, a 15-minute bike ride away, but even so, the tragic death of a lonely old man could not be avoided.
She actually had some contact with her mother, or she wouldn't have found her mother's body. She said she came home on a whim and found her mother on the floor and there were crawling insects all over the floor. No one knows when she died. The coroner couldn't give a definite answer. Her daughter was also single, but she kept telling me directly that her mother was not a nice person, but a very stereotypical and withdrawn person, and that no one wanted to make friends with her, and that even the neighbors didn't want to hang out with her, and that she would fight with her every time. But when you go in, you'll find that this mother loves to cook because I'm in charge of cleaning her refrigerator, and there are all kinds of ingredients and all kinds of spices, and I'm really shocked by the number of spices, and you'll find that she loves to cook, and I'm sure she loves life, and she's making all kinds of food, and wine, and all kinds of wine, and then finally, the second floor is not contaminated, so it's not cleaned. The second floor was not polluted, so it was not cleaned. Her room was still there and she did not let us take pictures, but there was a big master bedroom which was her mother's room, and when you lifted the bamboo curtain and looked over there was a big green area with trees and fields and crops because the place was more suburban, and there were several small independent buildings, and the courtyard of each Japanese building was full of flowers. The kind that makes you feel happy and quiet when you look over there. I said, what do you remember most about your mother in this room, or what do you remember most about this room? She said, there's a sewing machine there, and when I was sleeping at night, I used to hear my mother doing some handwork with the sewing machine. My mother also used a sewing machine when I was a child, and when I was sleeping at night, I could hear her stepping on the sewing machine, right? She didn't want to talk about it, but she said it was just a mother-daughter relationship, so she said it was just a mother-daughter family quarrel or something, and then it turned into a mutual lack of understanding.
But even if there is no conflict between them and their children, Japanese elderly people do not live with their children. Like in China, young people in Japan are working in big cities and their parents live in their hometowns and only see each other during festivals. Japanese communities and NGOs are making various efforts and attempts to reduce the number of lonely deaths.
How do they solve these problems? Of course, solitude is one of them. Solitude is one of them. For example, I went to a building on the edge of Tokyo Bay. They sing, they chat, they watch TV, they watch variety shows, they have all kinds of activities, and then he said why the Cherry Blossom Association is so called. He said what they look forward to most is when the cherry blossoms are in full bloom. They go to see the cherry blossoms every Wednesday afternoon. These old people, when they saw me, said, "It's okay, we're living a happy life," mainly women. Then one old man was very quiet and sat on the side and told me, "I'm afraid of dying alone." Except for the spontaneous meetings of the old people, they would usually bring milk and newspapers and leave them at the door, and if they found them untouched the next day, they would knock on the door for fear that something might happen to the old people inside. They make it a rule that all the old people in the village have to raise the carp flag in front of their homes in the morning, and then let the village headman take a look at it. Not only me personally, but I think many people, like many people, have been living with their parents for decades since they graduated from college, and you may see them only once a year during the New Year holidays. We can't change the social structure of the flow pattern, and you won't feel that the quality of my relationship with my parents will change because of this phenomenon, so you will feel quite helpless and lonely.
You're watching MetaNights, and I'm Anchor Loku. Thank you for listening, and we will see you next time.